stories. I'm sure these stories you keep hearing from Africa also, and Latin America also, and many other parts. But India is also one of your favorite country to, quote. What do you have to say?
Thank you, Osama. Well, thank you first also for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here representing, I guess, many voices. And so thank you for inviting us. So I work at the Global Digital Inclusion Partnership that I co-lead with my colleagues. And what we do is and I just want to give you an idea of who we are so you understand also the motivation for the work that we do. So we are a global coalition that brings together civil society, public sector, and private sector to work on policy, regulatory issues, but very much informing those policy change issues on evidence, research, experience, and what people everywhere, all people, want from digital opportunity. And when I say all people, I mean it, that I'm not talking about the elites. Our work focuses on what we call global majority countries, and we primarily focus on not just those who are unconnected, but the most marginalized. So I'm glad, Kavitha, that you already mentioned women and girls, but there are other groups of the population that remain marginalized, but women are by far, women and girls, the largest, most marginalized group in the digital space. So when we talk about digital inclusion and this concept that the summit is focusing on commoning the internet, it's a dream, something that the majority of the women, not just in India, but in many parts of the world, can only imagine and start conceiving without the possibility of actually actively engaging, enjoying, benefiting, and sometimes even dream about. And so let's start with India, but India is an example that is really important because you are a massive country and a country that has also done a lot of interesting things. You see a lot of progress, but at the same time, because of the great inequality that exists in the country, you have very large challenges. They're similar in other countries as well, but let's just pick up on gender, which is actually one of my favorite areas and an area that actually motivates me personally and our team as far as what we do. So here in India, you mentioned quite a few stats at the beginning of your introduction, Osama. You did mention the gender digital divide. So here in India, only about 30% of the women in your country use the internet. An even smaller percentage of the women in your country use a smartphone, which is what you need to be able to get to the internet. So the gender digital divide is very wide. Obviously, men are also unconnected. There's many, because as you said, only about 50% of the population or so is connected. But those who are counted as connected are also poorly connected. And what we mean by poorly connected is that people are often have the ability to go on the internet, but they can't do that every day. They cannot do it every time they need. They can only do it when they either can afford or when they have the ability of sharing a device with someone, as you were saying, Kavitha, in the rural areas, which is very common here, but it's also very common in other countries in South Asia, in countries in Africa, in countries in Latin America where we work. What's interesting about understanding these concepts is that for us, as activists, advocates of rights, as you were mentioning, we need to have very clear definitions, right? As some of your colleagues will say, when you work with governments, you have to have hard data and you have to have real concepts. If you don't, things get lost. So if I'll say, we need to have affordable internet to everyone, they'll ask you, what does that mean exactly, right? What is affordable and what kind of internet? So let me just spend a minute explaining that. We developed this definition a few years ago that became very useful to not only advocate for better policy, at the global level, but then at the national and local levels, really important to change the way to think about policy to make the internet available. But affordability became this concept that it was about the cost of just 1 gigabyte of data for everyone, everywhere, should not be more than 2% of their average monthly income. So think about that. No more than 2% of your average monthly income for everyone. So even if India as a country can say that on the aggregate that internet is affordable, the reality is that 60% of your population have much lower incomes than the top 20% or the top 5%, right? So the reality is that even in the aggregate, when things seem to be quite affordable, they are not. And this is why 70% of Indian women are not on the internet. And that's just the affordability of data. When you add to the affordability of data this idea that to be able to be on the internet, you need to have a device, you need to have good speed and data and frequency of use, you add another layer. And in every society, not just in India, sadly, women are also victims of income gaps. So it's not just the digital ecosystem, but the digital ecosystem sits in a socioeconomic space where inherent inequalities and structural differences also exist. So women in an Indian society and in other societies in Latin America and Africa are double, triple, quadruple excluded, not just because of incomes, because of social and cultural issues, but then because of the fact that we haven't managed to bring down prices and increase the quality of what people can pay so that people can fully enjoy the benefit of what it means to be online. So, in addition to the definition of affordability, this concept of meaningful connectivity that we've been talking about, it's all about the quality, because we realized, yes, even if people can afford a little bit of data, but if that data is not working, or most of the times, as you were saying, things are spinning around and you already spent your money and you still cannot get the information you needed, either about your rights or schooling or health, then it doesn't go anywhere. So thinking about how to change that digital access from a perspective that is more inclusive, but that also addresses these gaps is really important. And the gender gap, which also goes with the rural gap, is extremely, extremely critical to change. So when a politician or a policymaker tells us we're looking at digital inclusion and we have programs for universal access, I always ask them, okay, that's fine. So first the thing is, what's your target? What are you trying to get to? And do you have specific targets that are for rural areas, for women and girls, and all of those areas that you know you have gaps? If you don't have those targets and if you don't have specific ways of addressing those, you're actually not doing public policy in the public interest, because it's not covering everybody. It's only policy that works for a minority that tends to be already more privileged.
Thank you, Sonia.
I was just going to make a quick comment in response to what Nikhil was saying. One comment and a question. So the comment is, what's happening, which is really disappointing, is that governments around the world, including your government, Nikhil, is developing all of these assumptions to digitize services, right? Really using digitalization to deliver public goods, public services, when in fact the majority of the population, first of all, does not only is not connected, but even when connected, doesn't have the ability to benefit from those services. So this situation is not only contradictory, but it really makes you want to question governments. Why would you digitize and do all of these when by default the government is actually further excluding all of the population that cannot benefit from that service. So when a government thinks about digitalization of services, it needs to think, what do we need to do to make sure that everyone will be able to benefit from that service? And even if on a temporary basis, because of transitions and development, not everyone has a device, at least something like community centers, the kinds of things that you at the Digital Empowerment Foundation have done in India are very powerful, because then people have the ability to go to places where they can still have that service or get support to learn and get the skills to then use the service. But if you don't have that, if the government doesn't take responsibility to also fill that gap, then it's actually participating in further exclusion. My question was actually to our colleague from the state who's hosting us here. You talked about the state and how almost every single household is going to be connected by August of next year. My question is that program also coming with the kinds of support for people to actually be able to use the service? So it's not just about having the access, but use, because there's also a gap in usage, right? Benefiting directly. And are other states calling you here in India and maybe even other countries, are they calling you and asking you, how are you doing it? So that your lessons, what you are doing here, can be an example.
Machine learning in agriculture in order to use that data to make predictions, and that power dynamics really should be part of policy making going forward.
Thank you, Sonia.
What I would say is that if there are many young people or older people or middle-aged people in the audience and you want to make a difference and you want to think about different changes, policy changes, always think about everyone. Never think that one solution is going to be enough for everyone. And think about who you want to target, think about who you really want to reach, and do something special for that group. Otherwise, not everyone is going to be enjoying something like this idea of a common internet around the world, because we are part of that exclusion. So don't be part of exclusion, and think about ways to bring more people that are excluded to be part of that common experience that we want to have.